So here's something you have to understand. Low fighter pay is a lie for the simple fact that fighting, quite frankly, is not a real sport. And that also includes MMA and boxing because it's always operated under its own thing. In other words, a lot of people can't relate to a violent sport. However, people are fascinated by it, so therefore it becomes a spectacle, not so much of a real legitimate sport like you would see in the NFL, the NBA, the NHL, the Premier League, and maybe even NASCAR. It has always been its own thing. It's not universally loved. However, it is somehow universally admired because when you look at fighters, you think to yourselves, man, these guys are willing to do things that other normal human beings are not able to do or are not willing to do. So as a result, you have this fascination with the fight game, both casuals and hardcores alike. So this is something that's very important to understand when we try to move into the context of this whole entire matter. For one, here's something you got to understand. You look at the history of mixed martial arts. How many of these other organizations other than the UFC has ever survived? Strikeforce, gone out of business. WEC, gone out of business. Pride has gone out of business, bought out by the UFC. Bellator, bought out by the PFL, which PFL is going to suffer the same fate for the exact reason that they overpay their fighters without really understanding their long-term budget. And again, this may sound very displeasing to a lot of hardcore MMA fans, but here's something you have to understand. The reason why the UFC is able to deliver this particular product to you on a weekly basis is based on the budgets that they are playing by rather than trying to overcompensate fighters in which you think that they deserve or which you think that they are entitled to. Dana White said it best. Fighting is an opportunity, not a career option. In other words, there's going to be very few people that are going to have the Conor McGregor career, that are going to have the John Jones career, the George St. Pierre career, and the list goes on. So as a result, all of these fighters are fighting for the same thing, which is what? They are fighting for the top spot because it is the only way that you're ever going to have a secure life. Now, here's something you got to understand. A lot of people, especially in the world of American sports, they can't relate to it, and I can't emphasize that enough. It's a violent sport. A lot of people get hurt, and quite frankly, this is not a sport. And I'm going to tell you right now, this is combat. It may look like a sport because of the way ESPN, Fox Sports, and all these other entities such as Sky Sports, etc., sort of market it as a sport, sort of relatable to basketball or football or any other mainstream types of events and sporting sports out there. Look, here's something you have to understand, right? The way that they market mixed martial arts in the modern day. If you notice, remember in their Fox deal, right? What had happened? They sort of had this theme music that went da-da-da, 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 da-da-da. And where is that particular sound familiar from? Monday Night Football, Sunday Football, the pre-games that you see often before NFL games are being played. Why do they do that? Well, the reason why is because they want you to understand or want you to think that it is just like any other sport. But the reality is it's not. And quite frankly, if you are an American kid who is highly athletic, has a lot of great attributes in terms of, let's say, combine numbers, being able to run a certain amount of time in, a certain 40-yard dash or have a certain vertical leap, guess what? If you're smart, you're not going to go into fighting. And the reason being is because there's going to be other sports out there that's going to give you a better opportunity of a higher income to compensate for your talent. And not only that, if let's say you get hurt or injured, you're going to be compensated with, let's say, a certain retirement plan or a certain healthcare package that will set you up for things that fighting will just not offer you. And again, fighting is an opportunity. It is a way for people to reach a certain heights of glory that other athletes just will not be able to have. Because here's the thing, even though I'm saying all of this, the truth of the matter is fighting will always be a sport that more people will be fascinated by. But when you look at soccer, for example, you look at the history of it with the clubs in England that reach back all the way from the 1800s and then on. And you look at American baseball that has gone on for over 100 years. And then you look at American football, you look at basketball, there's a certain lineage and a certain tradition among families that get together and watch these games. For example, every time I'm at a Kings game in Sacramento around here, I look at all the families that come here and I think to myself, a lot of these people are generational fans. Now, it's not to say that you don't see that in boxing, because obviously you do, especially with the Hispanic American community. You look at the Mexican community and the Puerto Rican community and the Dominican community, for example. A lot of them have either been engaged in the boxing culture, participated in it, or somehow participated as a fan where they got all their families together to watch a Mike Tyson fight, a Miguel Cotto fight, or a Felix Trinidad fight, or an Oscar De La Hoya fight, or a Canelo Alvarez fight, and it's become their family tradition. However, you have to understand that fighting is not a real sport because it is too violent and a lot of people can't relate to it. However, a lot of people are going to be extremely fascinated by what these athletes can do and some of the things that they have to go through in training, and also some of the thrills and the agonies that are involved in a sport. So this is very important to understand when you are arguing for fighter pay. And here's another thing. If, let's say, the UFC was to overpay these fighters, how would the product look? Would you be able to have all the fights that you have every week, every single time? Would you be able to have the matchups that you wanted? Now, obviously, boxing nowadays is giving you all the matchups that, quite frankly, should be happening and should have happened a long time ago. However, that is due to the wealth and the prowess of the Saudi Arabian government and their interest in boxing and being able to invest in this particular sport. But before that, nothing of this sort has ever existed. So why am I bringing this up? Obviously, because of the current, or the recent rather, settlement of the UFC's lawsuit. $350 million they had decided to pay out all the fighters that were involved in that lawsuit. And they took the settlement rather than going to court. Now, why did they do that? Perhaps maybe they had lawyers behind the scenes that told them, this is what you need to do. You need to settle, because if you go into court, you will literally get nothing, and everything that we had worked for would have been an absolute vain. So as a result, guess what? This is what they had to do. However, let's say in a hypothetical situation, they did go through with a lawsuit. It would have opened up a can of worms, and to the point where the UFC, these three letters right here, would have gone out of business in the most worst hypothetical scenario that you could think of. And by the way, that is an absolute nightmare that you don't want to face. Because if you're a UFC fan, this is the reason why they're operating at the level and the rate that they're going at. Why? Because of the budgets that they have. So every time you complain about, oh, well, the fighter pay this or fighter pay that, guess what? You're talking against your own detriment as a fan and the product that you are witnessing every week and every weekend. So as a result, you look at Conor McGregor, right? Here's something you also have to understand in the other side of this argument, because I'm not here to present to you just one argument of the whole entire thing. You got to remember, I'm not an accountant. I don't understand finance at a high level, and especially not a sports management level, to where I can take a look at the bottom line of the UFC and why they make the decisions that they make. But what I can do is give you an objective take on the both sides of the matter. And the other side of the matter is Conor McGregor, because he is the most highest paid athlete in the history of the UFC, he is also the lowest paid athlete ever. And you're probably looking at yourselves thinking, how is that possible? Especially when he's got all these yachts, all these businesses. That's the main thing right there. The main thing is that he is able to obtain all of his money because of his businesses, which in turn was contributed by the product that he had built upon himself as a UFC fighter. So as a result, he is able to obtain this certain level of financial wealth, all because of the marketing of the UFC. However, when it comes to just the UFC and the money that they give him, the live gate that he brings into his particular events, he is absolutely the lowest paid athlete in comparison to these other boxers that you see in the fight game. Now, a lot of people also argue that, you know what, maybe, just maybe, if the Ali Act came into MMA, which, by the way, was one of the implications to this whole entire lawsuit, that somehow it would contribute to a better life for fighters. I highly doubt that. How's that working out for boxing? It always has been like this. You make and you receive exactly what you kill. So in other words, if you bring in all the pay-per-view numbers, okay, you're going to receive a certain amount. Now, I get it. Maybe in boxing, they have a certain 75 to 25 or 50 to 50 type of split with the promoters and the networks, right? Whereas with the UFC, the fighters overall are getting somewhere in the 18% range of what the company makes. But guess what? That is the reason why they are able to operate in the way that they do. The marketing, the fact that they have to travel in different cities, the fact that they have to pay a staff of people in order to set up the cages, set up the lights, set up the cameras, and not only that, set up the commentators that also have to be compensated, along with the staff of people that have to drive the trucks in order to get the production going. So this is the side that a lot of fans really don't want to take a look at, and with good reason, because most of you are not accountants, and neither am I. But what I am is sort of a combat sports journalist in a way that tries to give you the most objective takes while playing both sides and advocates to both parties, as you can see their own perspectives as to why they do what they do. Now, if you're a fighter, I'm sorry to tell you, but this is really what it is. You're not going to get compensated the way that NFL, NHL, NBA, and these other athletes. It's just not. And for this reason of what I just mentioned early in this particular content and video, you want me to repeat to you again? Most people can't relate to this sport. So therefore, you have to garner a certain level of attention that captivates the audience. You're not just going to make money off of this sport based on the fact that, well, because I'm a fighter. It's not like, let's say, if you sign with the Sacramento Kings or the LA Lakers, or maybe even, let's say, the New England Patriots, or the Manchester United or Manchester City football clubs out in the Premier League. When you sign to these teams, you're signing into an entity and a company that has a long-standing history and reputation with the fans that you inherit. So as a result, because of that, you're going to make and be compensated as such. Whereas with fighting, it's not the same thing. You have to captivate your own audience way beyond your own performance. So let me repeat that again. You have to captivate your own audience way beyond your performance. What does that mean? Well, you often hear a lot of fighters say, well, I'm just going to let my fighting do the talking. Okay, unfortunately to say, as much as I love this man and he's a fellow Muslim brother, how's that working out for Bilal Muhammad? Constantly getting passed up for title shots when everybody knows that he's earned it. And I'm sorry to be very objective and be very frank with that matter, but that's what it is. Same thing with Leon Edwards. Who would have thought that Leon Edwards could potentially become the pound-for-pound #1 fighter in the world, considering that he knocked out the #1 pound-for-pound fighter in the world in Kamaru Usman? And he had to wait for a very long time to receive that title shot simply because he didn't want to play up to his gangster persona, which he rightfully has, being that he has the type of father that he's grown up with and the type of reputation that he's had that he could have used to somehow market himself. But he chose not to. He chose to let his fighting do the talking. Obviously, in time, he still became the champion, and as a result, well, maybe the pay-per-view numbers that he does is going to suffer as a result of his actions or lack of actions. But the bottom line is, this is a reality of fighting. It's not a sport. It really isn't. You can scream to the top of your lungs and say that, well, it is a sport because you see the comparisons of how they present the sport as if it's some sort of Sunday football when Fox Sports play that music that I had just mentioned to you earlier. It's not. It's a completely different thing. It is in its own lane, and it always has been. Throughout the beginning of the centuries of the 1900s, when it was bare knuckle boxing that was the first prize sport in the Western world, this has always been the way that it is. It has never been a sport where it was so popular that everybody wanted to consume it on a weekly basis. Now, are there big events like, for example, UFC 300? Okay, maybe you can debate whether that's really going to be a big event or not, but let's name some big events that was really marquee for the UFC's history. For example, you had UFC 205 with Conor McGregor, where he took on Eddie Alvarez, right, to obtain the first ever double championship, holding two belts at one time, right? And obviously Daniel Cormier followed after, but not at the magnitude that Conor McGregor did. Prior to that, he had garnered the attention of people around the world and the huge support of his fellow countrymen in Ireland. And as a result, he was able to capture the imagination of fans around the world, and hence accumulated himself into this big event that everybody in the world wanted to watch. And I'm talking about UFC 205, which, by the way, another marquee aspect of that was it became New York's first ever legalized mixed martial arts event. Major event, that is, at least from my knowledge and understanding of the history in that particular setting. So those things come once in a lifetime. And after Conor McGregor, I'm sorry to tell you guys, but the sport is going to look as dull as it always has been. Now, I've always mentioned and said that Conor McGregor contributed to the sport of mixed martial arts in numerous ways. One of them, I said that he brought the gangster rap culture into mixed martial arts, because otherwise, if it wasn't for him, this whole entire sport would look like a bunch of emo white kids listening to Creed and Limp Bizkit in their training sessions with pink hair. And I stand by that. There's a lot of realities to that particular matter that I'm explaining. But that's the reality of this sport. So if you don't understand that and you don't like it, I'm sorry to tell you, but there's going to be some trade-offs to where if you decide that these fighters are going to be even more compensated than they really should. Now, here's the thing. Here's the other aspect of this. If you're a prelim fighter, and by the way, I've met a lot of guys who are in the prelim levels of the UFC, and the entitlement that a lot of these guys have is just absolutely remarkable in the most annoying way. Okay, because they believe that because they fight in the UFC and they have these particular skills that got them there, that somehow they should be overcompensated than what they normally should. And somehow they believe that they shouldn't get a second job or this and that. Look, that is up to the UFC, but the fact that they're not doing that, you have to take into consideration that perhaps maybe they're doing something correct. And this is what you get. I'm sorry to say, a lot of people are not going to like this. A lot of fighters who are personal friends of mine who may watch this are not going to like this, but this is the reality of it. You have to go out there, market yourself, and hope for the best that you're going to be compensated as a result. Because here's the thing. Speaking of Conor McGregor, I want to tell you something that I really like that his trainer does, right? John Kavanagh. He's very active in the amateur mixed martial arts scene of Ireland, England, and Europe. Why? Because he emphasizes that in the pros, just like what he knows about Conor McGregor, you have to go out there and market yourself, trash talk a little bit, build a story. Now, if you don't want to do that, then just fight in the amateurs. The same thing in boxing. I'm sure there's the same mindset and ethos that boxing trainers who are both pro trainers and amateur trainers understand. He says that if you don't like the trash talking aspect of mixed martial arts, then just go amateur. Fight your amateur career, get some experience in, and then go about your personal life and do something else right after that. But if you want to go beyond that and make a career out of it, this is what you have to do. It's called professional fighting. It's called prize fighting. So how do you get to the prize while being professional? Well, for one, you got to have your own YouTube channel. You got to build a social media presence. You have to constantly go do podcasts and not say no, because guess what? Every opportunity where there's eyeballs on you, you can garner fans and a lot of attention for your next fight and your next fight after that. And also, when you get on the mic after you win, you can't just go and say, I'm just going to go fight anybody and anybody they put in front of me. Well, guess what? If they're going to do that, they're going to give you the hardest matchup that you can possibly find, and they're not going to allow you to develop. You're the biggest, baddest fighter in the world, right? So prove it. But otherwise, there's the other aspect of Khabib. Because here's a lot of criticism that Khabib has faced all throughout his career. A lot of people said that his record is padded early in his career. I'm here to tell you, duh, of course it would be. How else would he develop into the type of fighter that he is? For example, when he got into the UFC, he took on all comers. Even in the UFC 223, where he fought El-Kheer for the vacant 155 undisputed championship, he had to change opponents multiple times during that week, because if you remember, Tony Ferguson was taken out of commission based on an injury. So as a result, they tried to set him up with Pettis. The New York Athletic Commission said, we can't do Pettis because he's not ranked and he's not highly ranked enough to fight for a championship, which is sort of weird because guess who made up the rankings in the UFC is none other than the UFC themselves. They said that you can't fight Max Holloway because he wouldn't pass medical clearance. So then they finally found El-Kheer, who's a New York native, was around the block and just decided, hey, I'm going to go cut weight for the weekend and go fight one of the best 155 fighters in the world at the time. And now, in hindsight, one of the most legendary 155 champions of all time. And Khabib, during that time, when he was switching up opponents during that fight week, he just slept and said, wake me up when I find an opponent. He went and did his workouts. He went and cut his weight. He went and handled business. And he was willing to take on all comers. He would have taken on 3 to 4 guys that night in a tournament bracket if he could. But the problem is that a lot of you don't see that in hindsight and how he got there. How did he get there to where he's so fearless into taking on anybody that he wanted to? Well, for one, he padded his record early in his career, just like what most boxers do, because quite frankly, this is how you develop. Now, how do you develop if you are not, let's say, an A-side fighter? If you're not a fighter that markets yourself, what's going to happen? You're just going to end up being a journeyman, exploited into fighting anybody and anybody at any time without really realizing your potential. Because a lot of people say, yeah, boxers are cowards because they take on easy matchups in the beginning or this and that. But guess what? This is also the reason why world championship level boxing really is a whole lot harder to win a championship than it is in the UFC. And I know that's going to sound crazy to a lot of people, but guess what? It takes a lot of skill, a lot of development in order for you to fight at that highest level. How did that work out for Francis Ngannou? Because obviously a lot of people are going to say, well, he did great against Tyson Fury or this and that. Okay, maybe so. But I guarantee you Tyson Fury was not training for Francis Ngannou the way that he would for Alexander Usyk, based on the fact that there's a certain speed and a certain technical prowess that Alexander Usyk has that, let's say, Francis Ngannou would have never had. Tyson Fury has been knocked down multiple times and has been rocked by really strong punchers before, over and over again. So this was nothing new. Obviously, he came out winning, but nonetheless, when Anthony Joshua stepped in there with Francis Ngannou, we saw the difference in the technical deficiency that he had based on the fact that he was taking on somebody that had equal attributes in strength and athleticism, which you can argue maybe Tyson Fury doesn't have that. He does have agility. He does have a certain speed and a certain awkwardness in his style that makes him difficult to deal with. But nonetheless, Francis Ngannou was a bad matchup for Anthony Joshua. Why? Because Anthony Joshua had built up his whole entire career getting ready for that particular moment to look like the way that he did. And that's exactly why I say that Khabib is exactly where he's at with why he was able to take the type of career trajectory that he took. easy fights in the beginning, getting your feet wet. And then next thing you know, he steps into the UFC 17-0 and is off and running, taking on all comers. By 2012, 2013, before he got injured, he was ready to take on all comers. And weirdly enough, as I mentioned Anthony Pettis earlier, it was actually Anthony Pettis that was the world champion when Khabib was a rookie in the UFC, if you want to put that in perspective. And he was ready to take him on. Obviously, injuries plagued him. The lack of superstar marketing wasn't behind Khabib as of yet. But that's why I always say that Khabib was very blessed to be in a position that he's at, because he's not a trash talker. He's not the most... I'm going to be very careful how I say this. I'm not going to say he's not the most charismatic guy, but he doesn't go out and try to be charismatic in the way that Colby Covington does. It's just going to capture your imagination straight away. Not at all. But the trajectory of his career, having the beef that he had with Conor McGregor and the implications of that matchup and the storylines behind it, literally made him the superstar that he is today. And then after that, it followed suit with the Dustin Poirier fight. By the way, strangely enough, this shirt right here is from the Dustin Poirier fight that he had at UFC 242 back in, I believe it was 2019, that fight had happened. So now he was off and running after that. He took on Dustin Poirier, and then after that, he ended his career with Justin Gaethje at an empty crowd arena during the pandemic, and that was that. He rode off into the sunset, and as a result, he used that marketing to build up his own brand, started doing different businesses with different business ventures, also opened up his own fight promotion for what that's worth. But the bottom line is, very few guys are going to have that same opportunity that Khabib, Conor, and all these other names that I had mentioned. And speaking of which, I got to tell you, now on the 27 mark of this content, I'm going to talk about KHAMZAT Chimaev and Robert Whitaker. So now that matchup has now been announced for June 22nd for the Saudi Arabia card. Now, what do I think about this matchup? I'm going to tell you right off the bat, this is going to be a bad matchup for Robert Whitaker. But how will this fight end? I got to tell you, it's going to end either two ways. But both of them are going to be within the confines of KHAMZAT's victory. Why? And you're probably thinking, well, of course, a bearded Muslim guy who has the same appearance as KHAMZAT is going to say that he beats him. Well, yes, because quite frankly, he's on his way up and Robert Whitaker is on his way down. Now, did he have a great performance against Paulo Costa? Absolutely. But he was supposed to do what he's supposed to do with Paulo Costa. This right here is the highest level of fighting right now where Robert Whitaker is at. Quite frankly, Paulo Costa is just not at that level. You've seen it in the way that he got finished with Izzy, and the fact that he was a little bit inactive for a while sort of didn't help his case. Well, now you're facing KHAMZAT, who's at a high level, who, by the way, is ready to be champion, let alone also ready to be a top contender. Or did I say that in reverse? He's ready to be a top contender, better yet, ready to be a champion. But either way, this is not looking good for Robert Whitaker because it's going to end two ways. It's either going to look like the Gilbert Burns-KHAMZAT fight, or it's going to look like Robert Whitaker getting knocked out by Dricus du Plessis. Now, why do I say that? Why am I saying that these two things are going to happen? Or either one of these two things are going to happen? I'm going to tell you why. For the simple fact that KHAMZAT, just like Dricus du Plessis, has Superman attributes. What do I mean by that? What I mean by Superman attributes is that there are certain guys that, let's say, if during a fight, not to say that they have technical deficiencies, but if they show technical deficiency mid-fight, they can get away with it just by using a certain level of strength that they possess or a certain level of speed and attributes that can get them through tough situations. Hence why I believe there could be a knockout or a submission in the part of KHAMZAT Chimaev going into this fight. Why will I also say that it may look like the Gilbert Burns fight? Well, for one, you have to understand that with the type of experience and the type of toughness that Robert Whitaker has, he may just take KHAMZAT to the distance, give him a very hard fight, but while giving him a hard fight, he may have not have the same type of skills that, let's say, KHAMZAT has been developing over these years now, to where I think it's going to take KHAMZAT a whole lot further than a lot of people would imagine. So I'm going to go with KHAMZAT and his win on this particular contest in either a finish or by a decision, and it will really depend on how they feel that night, how the pace of the fight is going to go in the first couple of minutes, and not only that, also how their training camp is going to go in terms of their injuries and how they really concentrated on their efforts leading up to that fight. So that is all that I have for this particular content. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and I will see you guys for the next one, inshallah.